I endured years of humiliation, but the day Mark announced to the family that I should sign a post-nup to simplify things, they stabbed me in the back by trying to kick me out and hand my place to his new assistant. I stood at the kitchen sink, the lemon-scented dish soap slipping through my fingers, and listened as they made a plan that would have left me with nothing. They thought I would cry, beg, or run. They did not know I had been counting, cataloging, and quietly keeping their secrets in a ledger they would never open. I wasn't a sad wife. They were building a house on a foundation of paper I had arranged to collapse. My name is Evelyn Clark, and I am 33 years old. Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get what they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the first winter I moved in and learned the rules of their house. I met Mark at a networking breakfast. He had a loud laugh and a smile that said, "Future," and I wanted a simple life, warm coffee, a garden, partnership. He told me stories about his childhood, how he was the responsible one, how his mother, Gloria, had taught him to value appearances. He told me he was building a company. He did not tell me the version everyone else began to believe, the one where he was a golden child who never scraped a knee. I told them I was a junior consultant. I wore thrift store blouses because I liked them. I kept my car because it was comfortable. The truth was quieter and more dangerous. My legal name and my bank accounts were tied up in trusts my mother had set up before she died, and the corporate shares that had been promised to me were held in a series of shell entities. I had chosen to keep that arrangement secret, not because I was ashamed, but because of a promise. On my mother's deathbed, she had said two things. Never let money be the reason you stay with someone, and let them show you what you're worth before you show them what you're worth. I honored that second instruction like scripture. I wanted to know whether Mark loved me, the person washing dishes at his sink, or whether he loved the idea of marrying into a shiny future. So I let him believe I had little. The house integrated me slowly and insidiously. Gloria, his mother, would sit at the head of the table and rate my forks. Too plain. She would sniff about my sweater. Paige, his sister, called my apartment cozy, with a derisive laugh that meant poor. Mark's friends would tease me into the corner, and eventually everyone laughed at the same jokes about the girl who prefers buses. The more I suffered, the more comfortable they grew in their cruelty. They expected me to be small in public and invisible in private. I bussed myself to the office in snow more than once because the family car was for errands. I sewed torn sleeves under the fluorescent light of our kitchen because pain should look like patience in their home. People like Gloria like to believe they are gatekeepers of value. They assumed my silence was evidence of weakness, but my nights were a different life. While the house slept under quilts of entitlement, I worked. When everyone else went to bed, I opened my laptop and logged into accounts no one associated with me. I taught myself the subtle forensic languages, handwriting the flows of money into spreadsheets, learning the shorthand of shell companies, decoding names on deeds. I am good with numbers because you can't lie to a number if you know how to ask it questions. There is a moral theater to being underestimated. They would make jokes about my tiny check, and I would smile, file the expense report, and keep a mental ledger. The humiliation was a test, and I never let them see my answers. Greed is a scent. You notice it like the first bad note of perfume at a cocktail party, sharp, overstated. It collects on clothes, in conversations, in casual plans that sound like brainstorms. What if we used her savings to finance the new master bath? Gloria mentioned breezily during a Sunday dinner how a few thousand could bridge the renovation bills. Paige laughed. Mark's new assistant, Amber, had begun to employ a particular laugh that belonged to women who think men are doors. The plot formed like a bruise. I was proud and naive enough to believe it would remain a suggestion, but they moved quickly and dishonestly. They started with small things. Borrowed jewelry that disappeared, a check cashed in my name without my permission, a vintage coat temporarily held at Gloria's house. Then ambition made them bold. Mark presented a post-nup at the table one evening, an outrage wrapped in calm words, aimed to sign to keep things clear. On paper, it would cut off everything I might claim, and it would give Amber a formal path into my life, a future they imagined as secure for themselves and humiliating for me. What they didn't reckon with was the language they used in private messages. Between champagne toasts, between recipes and repairs, they were clumsy. Pride makes people sloppy. They sent flippant texts about selling Evelyn's name off, about putting my shares into a holding they'd rename. They bragged in coffee shops about a small inheritance they had found, tiny, they called it, with unanimous smirks, and planned to funnel it into their contractor's account. Their greed had a fatal flaw. They needed other people to touch the ledger, bankers, brokers, a fast-talking notary named Harris. Those people kept records. Those records speak in cold voices when you ask them politely, and even louder when you ask under oath. I knew the pattern of how small thieves build big empires: an off-books payment, a friendly check cashed, a whisper to a contractor that the rest will come later. I also knew where those whispers could be traced. The day they decided to push Amber from assistant to resident, the house held a party. They announced an engagement of sorts, temporary, a plan, just until the real numbers were comfortable. They assumed my humiliation would suffocate any resistance. They assumed, crucially, I had no access to the financial levers they used to power their life. They were going to take my tiny inheritance and use it as a veneer to retire their debts. They were going to make it legal to oust me by manufacturing a narrative where I had voluntarily signed away my claims. They believed in the old lie, that legal papers read by happy pairs of hands are impenetrable. They did not know how deeply I had prepared. I do not have a revenge that arrives with fireworks. Mine is a confidence that arrives like an audit notice, precise, immovable, cold. When the plot spread like spilled wine, I stopped being hurt and started being methodical. First, I built a map. I printed every text, every bank transfer, every flirty DM that referenced covers and loans. I requested copies of deeds, of contractor contracts, of Gloria's email exchanges with Harris. I had a trusted ally from my consulting days, Richard Hale, a retired corporate litigator who owed me a favor for catching a compliance error years ago that I called at 3 a.m. He became the voice that whispered, "You need proof, and you need it traced." I arranged trusts and deeds the way chess players set traps. The shares that would eventually matter were already under my control through a trust my mother had established overseas, the kind of thing people assume is too complex to bother with. Under the trust, a corporate entity I had quietly established in my mid-20s held a controlling interest in the regional company Mark banked on to build his image. I was, in legal terms, the majority shareholder the family paraded around as if Mark had earned the throne. But a controlling share on paper means nothing without a record. So I set one. I initiated a forensic audit into the company Mark pretended to run. Not by making noise at the office, that would have drawn suspicion, but by engaging Baldwin Forensics under a shell I had established for exactly that purpose, Evelyn Clark Consulting. The auditors asked precise questions and turned up bank transfers that could not be explained, loans to Gloria indexed as intercompany advances, invoices from a contractor whose bank account traced back eventually to a shell-holding company in a name Mark's sister-in-law had used. I requested legal notices quietly. I secured an emergency court clerk who would process an injunction on behalf of a nominal creditor. I filed quiet complaints with the bank about fraudulent endorsements and unauthorized check signings. I obtained certified copies of documents that showed the patterns of theft I suspected. Most importantly, I prepared my theater. If they wanted a public humiliation, then public would be the stage. I organized a family gathering 2 weeks after the post-nup incident. dressing as the same woman they had always dismissed, modest, smiling, a new thrift blouse with a deliberate, gentle hem. I wanted them to be comfortable. I wanted to watch the arrogance bloom. I also arranged the legal implements that would act faster than any sermon of conscience. An eviction notice tied to a lien on the property, filed through the court, a notice to the board naming me as a shareholder with the right to call an emergency meeting, a frozen account order attached to their contractor's bank because the invoices were fraudulent, an NDA enforcement that would instantly end Amber's promotion by revealing a breach of confidentiality she'd signed if she had been involved with misappropriation of funds for the family. The pieces had names like deeds, trusts, audits, shell companies. Each had a quiet clinical purpose. There is an art to waiting. I timed everything so that questions would land in the same breath as dismissive laughter. I made sure the people responsible for the smallest acts would be the ones who had to answer for the biggest exposures. When the auditors reported anomalies, I let them file. When the bank clerk flagged a suspicious transfer, I let protocol take the wheel. I never raised my voice. I collected signatures with a smile. I recorded a short video statement for the board under the premise of clarifying family business, where I calmly laid out my connection to the shares and my concerns about fiduciary mismanagement. My voice at the time felt like ice. Ice cuts, clean, deliberate. With Richard's help, we drafted a letter, an ultimatum framed as help. It said we would take official action on the discrepancies discovered unless the company agreed to an immediate internal remedy and a removal of all funds diverting from corporate accounts. The letter went to the family, the board, and crucially, to the contractor and Harris. They had always believed that public shame was the sharpest weapon. They had never seen a quiet legal hand unsheath the kind of cold consequences that look less like spectacle and more like inevitability. Thanksgiving felt like an invitation the family wrote themselves into. They invited neighbors, old friends, and the kind of cousins who judge your casseroles. Gloria polished her silver, Mark practiced a smile that suggested shared jokes, and Amber arrived in a dress that said, "Soon." We sat down. There were prayers, there was cranberry sauce, and there was the small, delicate cruelty of normalcy. Gloria told a story about money and how things had to match a certain standard. Mark toasted their secure future. The air smelled of gravy and entitlement. It was then I stood. I had my purse, the paper folder with certified copies of the auditor's report, and a calmness I almost envied. The room expected tears or a flustered woman inhaling loudly, capitulating. The room expected me to be part of the set. "Before we finish," I said, my voice steady, "I have something brief to share." They looked at me like a group about to find a small insect in the mashed potatoes. Gloria smiled with the practiced benevolence of a woman who has never been interrupted. I laid the auditor's report on the table. The action was quiet. The recording devices I had set on a loyal cousin's phone remained hidden. I needed witnesses and the law's own paper trail. "These are the findings from Baldwin Forensics," I said. "They document multiple unauthorized transfers from company accounts to an external contractor, invoices that were never fulfilled, and transfers made to entities controlled by Ms. Paige Thompson under the name Page Enterprises." A fork clattered. "That's ridiculous," Paige snapped, a vein at her temple. "All performance. You have no idea what you're talking about." "I do," I said, "because I contracted the audit as a concerned shareholder. I am, in fact, the majority shareholder. My mother's trust holds a controlling interest in the company Mark uses as his background." Gloria's smile thinned. "Evelyn, you can't." "You're right," I said softly. "I can. Under Colorado Corporate Statute 7-1-602, a majority shareholder may call a special meeting. I have filed notice to call a special meeting to review these transactions. In addition, I've filed a temporary injunction to freeze the accounts tied to these transfers pending further investigation." A hush. The turkey steam seemed to shiver. Mark went red. "You can't do this. This is family, not court." "Family is not a legal defense," I said. "The bank has been notified. The contractor's account is under review. Ms. Page, the invoices under your shell company are tied to accounts I can show you now. Harris, the notary who filed certain endorsements, has offered his deposition to the auditors." The room became an organism of reaction. Amber whispered to Mark. Gloria rose and moved toward me with the graceless speed of someone whose social currency was being taken by force. "You're tearing our lives apart," Gloria hissed. "Do you understand what you are doing to us?" "I'm restoring what you took," I said, "and protecting a company from further theft." That was when the sheriff arrived. It was not flamboyant. He had a small car and a discreet badge. I had filed an eviction notice and a lien earlier in the day in the county records. The paperwork was processed quietly, sanctioned by the clerk's office. The sheriff presented the documents, his voice direct. "Ma'am, the family has been served for unauthorized occupancy under the recorded lien." He turned to Gloria. "Ms. Thompson, you have 72 hours to vacate the dwelling registered under the title now held in lien until the court resolves the matter." Gloria's hand flew to her chest. She began to beg, to promise, to offer money. It was not yet the final blow. I then played a video clip that had been recorded with a legal release from a contractor who confessed on camera to billing for work never performed and naming the people who signed off on the payments. The contractor named Gloria and Page. The contractor named Harris. The contractor named Amber as someone who helped with the paperwork. The footage was calm, the voice steady. The room folded in on itself. I did not scream, I did not weep. I laid out the next steps like a surgeon explaining the operation. "The board will convene. I have a right to seat observers. The accounts are frozen. If you want to cooperate and rectify the transfers, we can negotiate. If not, the auditors will make findings public and we will proceed to civil claims." The emotional reactions were theatrical. Mark lunged for argument, for bargaining, for the old songs of male bravado. Page attempted a fainting spell that looked practiced. Gloria tried to deploy a sob that had the rhythm of a used chorus. But the room had become a courtroom. Everyone who had believed in symbols suddenly had to confront the weight of documents. The final humiliation came from the very woman Mark had hired, Amber. She hadn't bargained for legal consequence. Facing cross-examination from the auditors, her phone's messages made obvious, she chose to accept a small plea. To sign an affidavit admitting she had knowingly accepted benefits in exchange for her silence on falsified invoices. The affidavit was a sharp noise in the house's soft fabric. She signed. She left with a folding suitcase, a phone full of messages the auditors would release to the proper agencies. By the time the dessert was served, no one had the appetite. The family that had sat in comfortable cruelty learned, as a small bitter lesson, that the law is not a stranger to kitchens. They begged. There were offers that smelled of desperation, transfers of their personal funds, promises to repay with interest, groveling emails that would have made humble people weep. Gloria sent a courier with a silver tray, something that said, "Remember when I taught you how to set a table?" She left voicemails in which she called me Eve, like an attempt at intimacy. I listened. I considered. I reviewed the costs and the benefits. There is a satisfaction in watching someone realize consequence, but revenge is not a banquet for the soul. It is a clearing of accounts. I had no desire to break anyone beyond necessary. I wanted the lie to stop. I wanted the house, the company, and the narrative to be rebuilt on truth or to be forced to end. I rejected most offers. I accepted one honest plan: a mediated restitution where Gloria and Page would begin to repay funds they had diverted and where the contractor would be criminally referred. I arranged for Page to undergo community restitution, and for Gloria to be removed from the company's check-signing authority. Mark was required to step down pending an independent director's review. They moved out of the house under the supervision of the courts. They found smaller apartments, and the look of entitlement was shrunk by reality. They called and apologized in varying degrees of sincerity. I responded precisely. Apology accepted upon proof. I said nothing else. It was the best way to give them room to learn or to keep their apologies as empty sound. I kept one thing. The quiet peace of a life no longer performed. I reclaimed the apartment where, once, the microwave had been the centerpiece of our late-night solace. I took the small garden plot I had always wanted. I paid the contractor the remainder legitimately owed for the one day a real repair was needed, with a check he could not argue about. Certified, recorded, transparent. The company stabilized under the emergency board. I appointed a non-executive director to oversee compliance. I installed better controls. I changed passwords and moved sensitive documents to a secure vault with a password only I and Richard knew. The final act of mercy was small. A letter sent to the family that began, "I did this not for revenge, but for restoration." I meant it. There is more mercy in justice than in private vengeance. The family had been allowed to test the same lesson my mother taught me. True standing is not demonstrated by what you take from others, but by what you refuse to allow others to take from the world. Years later, when relatives asked, "Was it worth it?" I would sometimes answer, because the question deserves honesty. The work cost me nights. It cost me the illusion of a simple life, and it cost me the idea that love would always be patient. But it yielded a quieter gift, sovereignty. I now wake without the small fear of an unexpected text that will force me to apologize for being myself. I now meet people who love me for my margins and for my numbers, both of which I work to balance. If there is a moral beyond the obvious, it is this. When people treat you as less than, keep a ledger. Document the bruises as if they might one day be evidence. And if you are able, make your power invisible at first, so that when you choose to reveal it, it dismantles abuse with a clarity that cannot be shouted away. I still sometimes sit at that same kitchen table and set out a simple meal. When the mail comes, there is rarely any drama. Occasionally, a postcard arrives from a cousin who watched the whole affair unfold on the news, an apology that isn't a restoration but reads like one. I put such postcards in a drawer and close it gently. For those of you listening tonight from living rooms and smart TVs, not every story ends with a dramatic scream. Some of us win with patience and paperwork. Some of us win because we learn to love our own quiet power. If you have been underestimated, consider what you might build in the silence they thought was your weakness. Thank you for staying with me through this. Tell me where you are watching from in the comments below, and subscribe if you want more stories where the quiet protagonist outsmarts loud entitlement.